In the arid landscape of Hermosillo, Sonora, where the desert sun bleaches color from the earth, a structure rises like a fever dream. It is an architectural phantom, a monument to an ambition so vast it defied its own geography. Known locally as the Palace of 1001 Nights, it was meant to be an oasis of impossible luxury, a testament to a power that could command reality itself. Today it stands as something else entirely, a ruin, a scar, a silent testament to the empire that built it and the man who vanished from within it. The perimeter walls, once high and impenetrable, are now scarred with the graffiti of a generation that knows the building only as a legend. They were designed to keep the world out, to create a private universe sealed from prying eyes. Now, they are porous, breached by time and neglect, offering an open invitation to witness the decay of a kingdom. The palace no longer defends its secrets, it merely houses the ghosts of them. A profound silence hangs in the air, broken only by the sound of wind whistling through the hollow arches and empty window frames. It is a heavy, weighted silence, one that has absorbed the echoes of whispered conspiracies, lavish parties, and unspoken threats. The heat radiates from the cracked stone and faded tiles, a constant, oppressive presence that feels like the lingering memory of the power once concentrated here. This is not the quiet of peace, but the stillness of an immense machine that has ground to a halt. Its design is a deliberate fiction, a fantasy of Moorish and Mediterranean opulence, transplanted by force into the heart of northern Mexico. Horseshoe arches and ornate tilework speak of distant lands and ancient dynasties, a style chosen not for its harmony with the surroundings, but for its complete and total defiance of them. The palace was an assertion that its owner's will was stronger than culture, stronger than place, a declaration that his empire recognized no borders, not even aesthetic ones. This structure is more than a backdrop. It is a primary actor in the drama of its own creation and collapse. Its walls, constructed with laundered money and paranoid precision, are a physical record of a criminal enterprise. Every empty hall and crumbling colonnade holds a piece of the story. The building was a silent accomplice, a vessel built to contain the immense invisible power of its master, a man who sought to control the very air above the continent. In the main courtyard, a massive fountain sits at the center of the symmetrical design. It was conceived as the heart of the palace, a symbol of the ceaseless flow of wealth and influence that sustained the empire. Today, its basin is a dry concrete husk, filled with rubble, weeds, and the detritus of decades of abandonment. The source has run dry. The cracked stone is a tombstone for the torrent of power that once animated this place. The scale of the ambition is staggering, frozen in a state of incompletion. Entire wings of the palace remain unfinished, their exposed rebar reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. These unfinished sections are not just evidence of a project interrupted, but a perfect metaphor for the empire itself, a colossal undertaking left half-built, its grand design forever unrealized, its architect having disappeared before the final stone could be laid. Inside, the texture of decay is palpable. The smell of dust and sun-baked concrete has replaced the scent of precious cedar and imported marble. Where opulent rugs once lay, the floor is a mosaic of broken tiles and wind-blown sand. The light that filters through the grime-covered windows illuminates not grandeur but its ghost, revealing the immense void left behind when the lifeblood of the house was suddenly cut off. Yet, this palace was always a duality, a place of profound contradiction. It was designed as a stage for extravagant pleasure, with its sprawling pools and banquet halls, but it was engineered as a fortress. Each beautiful tower was also a watchtower. Every serene garden was a potential landing zone. It was a labyrinth of luxury, built to simultaneously display power and defend it from the inevitable retribution that power attracts. The legends that cling to these walls speak of a world hidden beneath the surface. They tell of secret tunnels for swift escapes, of panic rooms fortified with steel and concrete, and of a sophisticated surveillance network woven into the very fabric of the architecture. The palace was a mask, its Arabian fantasy facade concealing a cold, functional apparatus of command, control, and violence. It was the ultimate materialization of an intangible empire, a physical anchor for a kingdom built on air. Its master was a man obsessed with invisibility, a ghostly figure who ruled from the shadows. This palace was his one concession to permanence, a private monument for a king who refused to have a public face. He built a world meant to last forever, only to have it become the most enduring symbol of his own disappearance. The sheer audacity of its construction speaks to a power that felt limitless, untouchable. The millions of dollars transformed into stone and fantasy were more than an indulgence. They were a message. This was the work of a man who believed he was beyond the reach of law, of gravity, of fate itself. The house was his earthly throne, the center of an invisible web that stretched across a hemisphere. Luxury was just the surface. What happened inside, few dared to know. To understand the man who built this kingdom of shadows and the empire that collapsed within its walls, subscribe to follow our investigation into the heart of the ruin. To understand the palace, one must first understand the ghost for whom it was built. Long before the first stone was laid in the Sonoran desert, the foundation was being poured in the mind of a boy from a world 1,000 miles and a psychic universe away. The origin of this monument to invisibility lies not in wealth, but in the lessons learned from a childhood steeped in the precise calculus of survival. Amado Carrillo Fuentes was born not into a vacuum, but into a dynasty of risk, a family whose name was already being etched into the nascent folklore of the Mexican drug trade. The world that shaped him was one of baked earth and scarce water, in the small Sinaloan town of Guamuchilito. This was the cradle of narco-trafficking, a region where the line between agriculture and contraband had long been blurred by poverty and opportunity. Here, ambition was a raw, unrefined element, and the paths to power were few. One could work the land for meager returns, or one could cultivate the crops that fed an insatiable hunger to the north. For the Carrillo Fuentes clan, the choice had already been made. He was nephew to Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, the formidable Don Neto, a founding father of the Guadalajara cartel. Amado did not enter the trade as a desperate outsider. He was born into its aristocracy, but his inheritance was not one of effortless command. It was a place at the table of violent, ambitious men, where a single misstep could erase a bloodline. He was granted access, but survival and ascent would depend entirely on his own faculties, on his ability to navigate a world of shifting allegiances and sudden betrayals. From his unique vantage point, the young Amado became a quiet student of power. He watched the capos of his uncle's generation, men who reveled in their notoriety. They wore their power like a mantle of gold chains and silk shirts, their presence announced by convoys of armed guards and the sound of banda music. They were legends, but they were also targets. Amado observed their flamboyance, their public displays of wealth and violence, and he understood it not as strength but as a fatal vulnerability. His apprenticeship in the family business was telling. He showed little interest in the performative brutality that earned others their fearsome reputations. Instead, he was drawn to the mechanics of the operation, the routes, the schedules, the points of corruption, the silent, intricate dance of logistics. He learned the rhythms of the border, the patterns of law enforcement, and the subtle language of bribery. His first contributions were not acts of violence but of efficiency. He was not a warrior, he was a systems analyst. The moral tipping point for Amado Carrillo was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, calculated shedding of sentiment. It was the gradual realization that in his world, the loudest voice was often the first to be silenced. His genius was in recognizing that true, lasting power was not held but wielded, and that it was most effective when its source remained unknown. He chose the path of the ghost, the whisper, the unseen hand that moved the pieces on the board, while others postured as kings. His ambition, therefore, took on a different shape. While his contemporaries dreamed of conquering rival plazas and appearing in corridors, Amado dreamed of a seamless global supply chain. He looked at the single-engine Cessnas hopping nervously across the border and envisioned a fleet of commercial jets. He saw the sky not as a barrier, but as a vast, unpoliced continent, a private highway waiting to be claimed. His vision was corporate, systemic, and utterly devoid of romanticism. The cataclysm that solidified this philosophy was the 1985 abduction and murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena. The incident, carried out by the Guadalajara cartel, brought the full weight of the American government down upon his uncle's organization. He watched as the most powerful men in Mexico, men he considered invincible, were hunted, captured, and imprisoned. Their mistake was not the crime itself, but the arrogance of it. They had made themselves too visible, too loud, and the system they built crumbled under the glare of the spotlight. This was the moment the seed of the Hermosillo palace was truly planted. The lesson was seared into his psyche. Visibility is death. To build an empire that would last, he needed to become a phantom. And a phantom needed a sanctuary, a place so secure, so private, that it functioned as a separate reality. The idea of the house began not as a blueprint of rooms and arches, but as a psychological diagram of control, a physical answer to the terror of being seen. It would be a structure built on a contradiction. From the outside, it would be a fantasy, a dream of impossible beauty that deflected attention through its sheer implausibility. But its inner architecture would be one of pure, cold function. It would be a fortress engineered for a king who ruled from the shadows, a command center for an invisible web that stretched across the hemisphere. The opulence was merely camouflage for the apparatus of control within. The choice of an Arabian architectural style was a deliberate act of psychological warfare. It was a style utterly alien to the Sonoran landscape, a fantasy transplanted by force. This aesthetic rupture was a statement. Its owner was not bound by geography, history, or convention. His power could create its own context, impose its own reality. The palace was not meant to belong to Hermosillo. It was meant to dominate it, a mirage made of concrete and steel. This growing obsession with a private fortress mirrored the expansion of his criminal enterprise. As he began to assemble his fleet of Boeing 727s, turning the sky into his personal dominion, he also began acquiring the land for his terrestrial throne. The two projects were intertwined, two sides of the same coin of systemic control. One was an empire of air and motion, the other an empire of stone and stillness. Both were designed to make their master untouchable. The house was a direct response to the deep, abiding paranoia that is the constant companion of absolute power in the criminal underworld. It was an attempt to build a physical cure for a psychological condition. Every potential threat, every conceivable angle of attack, every fear of betrayal was to be engineered out of existence through walls, surveillance, and spatial confusion. It was to be the one place on Earth where the ghost could finally rest, secure in his invisibility. The first drafts of the design were not commissioned from architects of luxury homes, but from strategists of security. The placement of every watchtower, the thickness of every wall, the route of every potential escape tunnel, these were the primary considerations. The jacuzzis, the marble floors, and the gilded fixtures were secondary. The decorative skins stretched over a skeleton of pure defensive logic. The palace was being conceived as the ultimate panic room. It was, therefore, far more than a monument to ego. It was a tool, a necessary piece of operational hardware for the kind of empire he intended to build. It was the materialization of his core belief that anonymity was the ultimate currency. The palace in Hermosillo would be the vault where he kept his most precious asset, his own non-existence. It was the only way to reconcile the need for a central command with the imperative to remain a ghost. As the first truckloads of concrete began to arrive in the Sonoran heat, a new reality was being poured into the earth. It was the beginning of an architectural marvel and a strategic masterpiece. But in constructing the perfect sanctuary to protect himself from the world, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was also building the walls of his own magnificent prison. The dream of a private universe was taking shape, but with it, the inescapable shadow of its own eventual ruin. The empire was not built with bullets, but with cargo manifests. Amado Carrillo Fuentes' genius was logistical, an almost sterile understanding of weight, distance, and fuel consumption. He saw the scattered, risky flights of his predecessors as an artisanal craft and sought to industrialize it. His vision was a supply chain in the sky, a corporate solution to a criminal problem. This revolution began with the acquisition of a fleet of retired commercial airliners, most notably several Boeing 727s, which transformed the scale of the possible. With the first successful flights from Colombia, each carrying tons of cocaine where single-engine planes once carried kilos. A torrent of capital was unleashed. This new wealth was too vast to be hidden in conventional ways. It demanded a new form of materialization. It was at this moment that the land in Hermosillo was acquired. The foundation of the palace was poured not just with concrete, but with the profits of an unprecedented aerial dominance. The house was the earthbound anchor for an empire taking flight. The design of the palace began to evolve in direct proportion to the growth of this golden fleet. As more jets were added, the blueprints for the compound expanded. The initial plans for a large residence ballooned into a sprawling, multi-building complex. Each new air route consolidated under his control seemed to correspond with the addition of a new courtyard, a new colonnade, a new wing. The architecture was a physical ledger of his ascent, a stone and marble record of his conquest of the skies. The construction itself became a primary mechanism for laundering this deluge of cash. Millions of dollars, impossible to deposit in any bank, were converted into tangible assets. Every truckload of sand, every pallet of imported tile, every hand-carved cedar door was a transaction that washed the money clean, transforming it from evidence of a crime into a statement of architectural fantasy. The palace was built to be a fortress, but it was also a financial washing machine of immense scale. The first structures to rise were not the opulent living quarters, but the perimeter walls. They were built high and thick, an immediate and uncompromising statement of exclusion. This initial phase of construction was a direct reflection of Carrillo's core philosophy: control the borders, secure the territory, and operate from within a sealed private universe. Before the fantasy of an Arabian palace could be realized, the cold, hard logic of a fortress had to be established. As the walls enclosed the vast property, the palace began to take shape as a decentralized organism, mirroring the cellular structure of his cartel. Different buildings were designed for different functions, creating a campus of power rather than a single monolithic home. There would be a building for residence, another for entertainment, and others whose purposes were intentionally obscured by the labyrinthine design. This physical separation of functions was a strategic choice, ensuring that no single breach could compromise the entire operation. The true catalyst for the palace's most audacious phase was the consolidation of political protection at the highest level. The alliance with General Jesus Gutierrez Rebollo, Mexico's drug czar, created a shield of impunity that made Carrillo feel untouchable. With the state's top anti-narcotics official on his payroll, the risk calculus changed entirely. The construction in Hermosillo, once merely ambitious, now became almost frantic, a physical expression of absolute confidence. Under the general's protection, the pace of work accelerated exponentially. What had been a project of years was now on a timeline of months. The influx of materials was constant, the workforce operating around the clock. The architectural ambition swelled to match its owner's sense of invincibility. It was during this period that the most extreme luxuries were incorporated: the Olympic-sized pools, the jacuzzis in every suite, the vast halls finished in marble and precious woods. The palace was becoming a monument to a power that believed itself to be above consequence. The expansion of the house became a material map of the empire's reach. As Carrillo's influence pushed from the Pacific to the Gulf, unifying the country's two main trafficking corridors, the palace grew symmetrically outward. New wings were added, creating a sprawling, almost city-like compound. These additions were not random. They were physical annexations, each new section representing another piece of the continent brought under his invisible control. A private chapel was integrated into the design, its serene facade concealing a space for a different kind of faith. It was not a place of public worship, but a private sanctuary where loyalty was sworn and pacts were sealed. Here, amidst the iconography of religion, the brutal codes of the cartel were sanctified. The chapel was the ultimate symbol of the empire's moral inversion, a place where devotion was pledged not to a higher power, but to the system Carrillo had built. The aesthetic of the palace, its Moorish fantasy, was now being fully realized. Horseshoe arches, ornate tile work, and barrel-vaulted ceilings were crafted with meticulous detail. But this opulent skin was stretched over a skeleton of pure paranoia. The beautiful design was a deliberate distraction, a theatrical set designed to mask the building's true function as a command and control center. The luxury was camouflage for the apparatus of a silent war. Every architectural element served a dual purpose. The soaring towers that gave the palace its fairy tale silhouette were also fortified watchtowers, offering panoramic views of all approaches. The vast, serene courtyards, designed for lavish gatherings, were also engineered as landing zones for helicopters, providing multiple points of arrival and escape. The entire property was a carefully designed labyrinth, intended to confuse and trap any unauthorized intruder while providing its master with a dozen unseen exits. As the empire matured, so did its leaders' obsession with security. The palace's specifications were upgraded from luxury to military-grade defense. Rumors of these additions became local legend. Panic rooms lined with steel, subterranean escape tunnels leading miles away from the property, and a surveillance network so sophisticated it was woven into the very walls. The house was being engineered to withstand a siege, a physical manifestation of a mind that lived in a permanent state of high alert. The contrast between facade and function was absolute. Behind the delicate latticework of a window lay panes of bulletproof glass. Beneath the imported marble floors of the grand ballroom, a reinforced concrete vault was rumored to hold caches of cash and weapons. The palace was a paradox, a place of extreme beauty designed to contain and facilitate acts of extreme violence. It was a dream of pleasure built upon a foundation of fear. The heart of this complex was the central courtyard, and at its center, the great fountain. As construction neared its zenith, the fountain was completed and activated. Water, sourced from deep wells that defied the desert climate, surged through its ornate structure. This ceaseless flow was the ultimate symbol of the empire at its peak, a constant, gushing torrent of power and money that seemed as if it would never end. The sound of the water was the sound of Carrillo's dominion, made audible. This flowing water animated the entire compound, reflecting the lifeblood of the cartel that pulsed through its invisible arteries across the hemisphere. It was a statement of defiance against the arid landscape, a testament to a power that could create its own oasis. The palace was now a living entity, a self-contained world operating by its own rules, sustained by the endless current of wealth that its master commanded from the sky. The construction of the main structures represented the consolidation of his power, a period when his authority seemed absolute and his system flawless. The mansion was no longer just a home or a fortress. It had become a private kingdom, the terrestrial throne for a king who ruled an empire of air. Its very existence was a projection of an ego that, while hidden from the public, demanded a private monument of staggering scale. But even at the height of its glory, the palace remained unfinished. Entire wings stood as concrete skeletons, their exposed rebar reaching towards the sky like unanswered prayers. This state of incompletion was not a sign of failure, but of a hubris so vast it could never be fully realized. The project was conceived as endless. Just like the power it was meant to house, an empire forever expanding, its final form never meant to be achieved. The structure was therefore a perfect biography of its builder, a masterpiece of logistical control, shielded by a fantasy, engineered by paranoia, and ultimately defined by an ambition so immense it was destined to remain incomplete. The palace was the ultimate materialization of an invisible man, a solid ghost haunting the Sonoran desert, its every detail a clue to the mind that conceived it. It stands as a complex portrait of a man's psyche, a place where opulence served as armor and beauty as a barricade. The desire for a magnificent stage for an audience of one reveals a vanity as deep as the paranoia that demanded its fortification. Which detail best reveals the builder's vanity, the marble ballroom, the bulletproof windows, or the underground vault? The heart of the palace now beat with a steady, liquid pulse. In the main courtyard, the great fountain was alive, its tiered basins overflowing with water drawn from deep, defiant wells. The sound was a constant, soothing roar, a declaration that the desert had been conquered, that the natural order of the world could be reversed by sheer will. This ceaseless flow was the sound of the empire at its zenith, the audible manifestation of a torrent of capital so vast it seemed to have no source and no end. The era of construction was over. The percussive sounds of hammers and saws had been replaced by a curated quiet, a heavy, opulent silence broken only by the fountain and the distant hum of the climate control systems. The palace was no longer a project, it was a functioning reality, a self-contained universe sealed against the harsh Sonoran sun and the prying eyes of an outside world that had ceased to matter. The air inside the perimeter walls felt different, heavier, as if governed by its own atmospheric pressure. Life within the compound settled into a rigid, almost monastic routine, but the faith practiced here was one of logistics and control. The staff moved with a disciplined quiet, their roles clearly defined, their presence unobtrusive. They were not servants in a home, but functionaries in a corporate headquarters, their loyalty ensured through a mixture of immense reward and unspoken threat. Every individual was a component in a machine designed for absolute efficiency. Arrivals were rarely announced. At dusk, helicopters would descend into the designated courtyards, their rotors churning the manicured gardens. Out of them stepped emissaries from the south, men with the hard, patient eyes of Colombian suppliers, or discreet figures in expensive suits carrying the implicit authority of corrupted government ministries. The palace was not a home to be visited. It was a destination for pilgrimage, the seat of a silent hemispheric power. Within the ornate meeting rooms, beneath barrel-vaulted ceilings painted with intricate patterns, the true business of the empire was conducted. Here, the brutal calculus of tonnage, routes, and percentages was debated with the cool detachment of a corporate board meeting. The Moorish fantasy of the architecture was a deliberate and jarring contrast to the cold, pragmatic nature of the conversations it housed, a layer of theatricality over a core of pure, ruthless enterprise. Amado Carrillo Fuentes presided over these summits not as a warlord but as a chairman. His presence was a center of gravity. His power derived not from boisterous commands, but from his quiet, analytical gaze and his encyclopedic knowledge of the system he had built. He was the chief architect, the master logistician, and his authority was absolute because it was based on an undeniable, systemic competence. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words reconfigured the flow of narcotics across a continent. The palace served as the ultimate stage for these negotiations. It was a physical argument for his supremacy, a space designed to overwhelm and impress. Allies were reassured by its permanence and stability, while rivals were intimidated by the sheer scale of the resources it represented. To be invited into this inner sanctum was to be acknowledged as a player, but it was also a reminder of who controlled the game. The lavish parties held within its walls were not celebrations of pleasure, but carefully orchestrated performances of power. Hundreds of guests would fill the grand ballroom and spill out into the colonnaded patios, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and grilled meats. Mariachi and banda groups played on raised platforms, their loud, festive music providing a blanket of sound beneath which sensitive conversations could take place, unheard. The excess was strategic. Tables groaned under the weight of imported delicacies and rivers of the finest tequila and cognac. The spectacle was designed to create a sense of intoxicating possibility, to demonstrate a wealth so profound it could be casually dispensed. It was a tool of seduction and control, a way of binding men to him through their appetites and their awe, making them complicit in the fantasy he had constructed. For the guests, a curated mix of cartel lieutenants, high-ranking military officers, powerful politicians, and provincial businessmen, attendance was both a privilege and a command. It was an opportunity to pay fealty and to gauge the shifting currents of power. They moved through the opulent spaces with a practiced ease, but their laughter was measured, their eyes constantly scanning the room, aware that they were both guests and subjects in this private kingdom. Yet even amidst these grand displays, the master of the house remained a spectral figure. He would appear, move through the crowds with a quiet nod or a brief word, and then vanish back into the private, more functional sections of the compound. He was the host who was never truly present, an observer of his own spectacle, his mind perpetually occupied with the invisible architecture of his empire. This visible opulence was merely the skin of the beast. The true nature of the palace was its function as a fortress, an apparatus of security so deeply integrated it was almost invisible. The handsome, uniformed men who stood discreetly in the arched doorways were not ushers. They were elite bodyguards, their eyes missing nothing, their hands never far from the weapons concealed beneath their tailored jackets. The house itself was rumored to be an electronic listening post. Sophisticated surveillance systems were believed to be woven into its very fabric, with cameras hidden in ornate light fixtures and microphones embedded within the thick plaster walls. In this gilded cage, privacy was an illusion, granted only by the owner. Every conversation was a potential piece of intelligence, every guest a potential threat to be monitored. Security protocols were a constant, silent ritual. Patrols moved along the perimeter walls in unpredictable patterns. Electronic sweeps for listening devices were conducted daily. Access codes for different sectors of the compound were changed at random intervals. The palace was a machine that never slept, a fortress operating on the assumption that it was under a permanent invisible siege. The labyrinthine design was a key component of its defense. Corridors turned back on themselves, courtyards led to dead ends, and entire wings were accessible only through hidden doorways. To an outsider, navigating the complex without a guide was impossible. It was a space designed to confuse and trap, ensuring that only its master could move through it with perfect clarity and purpose, an omniscient ghost in his own machine. This obsession with control created an environment of profound psychological isolation. The man who had built this monument to his own power was also its principal captive. The very walls that guaranteed his physical safety also served as the impenetrable barriers of his own private prison, cutting him off from the chaotic, unpredictable world he so effectively dominated. He was a king surrounded by a court, but fundamentally alone, insulated from genuine human connection by the deep, corrosive acid of paranoia. Every advisor was a potential usurper, every partner a potential traitor. Trust was a strategic calculation, not an emotional bond. The immense luxury of his surroundings became a sterile buffer, the gilded trappings of a profound and inescapable solitude. His most intimate relationship was with the structure itself. He understood its rhythms, its secrets, its strengths. The reinforced concrete and bulletproof glass were his most reliable allies, the only confidants whose loyalty was absolute and unquestionable. The palace was not just his fortress, it was a physical extension of his own guarded, fortified psyche. This duality was present in every detail. The serene private chapel with its hand-carved pews and stained glass windows was not a place for quiet contemplation. It was a chamber for swearing oaths of allegiance to the cartel, a place where the iconography of faith was used to sanctify pacts of violence and betrayal, the scent of incense mingling with the metallic odor of fear. The sprawling turquoise pools, designed to evoke an oasis of pleasure, were stages for the coldest forms of business. By their tranquil edges, under the shade of imported palm trees, fates were decided. Promotions were granted, betrayals were punished, and death sentences were passed with the same detached calm as a discussion about the weather. The placid surface of the water reflected a world of silent, brutal consequence. At this moment, with the state's protection seemingly absolute and the aerial corridors under his unquestioned dominion, the illusion of invincibility was complete. The system was a flawless machine, and the palace was its perfect, humming core. The sheer audacity of its existence seemed to prove that its owner operated in a reality separate from all others, beyond the reach of law, consequence, or fate. The constant gushing water of the central fountain was the ultimate symbol of this perceived permanence. It was a force of nature that had been manufactured, a torrent that seemed as if it would flow for eternity. But the very perfection of this closed, hermetic world was its greatest vulnerability. From within the walls of his magnificent fortress, the king could no longer see the storm that was gathering, silently on the horizon. The first sign of decay was not a gunshot, but a change in the water. In the great central courtyard, the fountain, for the first time since its completion, suffered a momentary interruption. Its powerful engineered roar faltered for a few seconds, a hydraulic cough in the system before resuming its steady flow. It was an insignificant mechanical flaw quickly corrected, but for those who understood the palace as a living organism, it was a tremor, a brief arrhythmia in the heart of the empire. This subtle disruption in the palace's lifeblood mirrored a new friction in the vast invisible machinery of the cartel. For the first time, a fully loaded Boeing 727 was unexpectedly grounded on a provincial airstrip by federal soldiers who had not been paid to look the other way. The shipment was lost, a multi-ton, 9-figure write-off. It was not a catastrophic blow, but it was a systemic anomaly, a sign that the perfect, frictionless universe of corruption Carrillo had engineered was beginning to develop resistance. The breach was not strategic, but human. A mid-level financial operative arrested in Texas on a minor charge broke under interrogation. He gave up little of substance, no roots or names of high-level contacts. But in a desperate attempt to bargain, he whispered a title he had only ever heard used in reverent tones, El Señor de los Cielos. It was not a name, but a myth, and for the first time, that myth was entered into an official DEA transcript. The legend, once a useful tool of intimidation within the underworld, now became a dangerous liability. The moniker was too cinematic, too evocative to remain a secret. It leaked from the interrogation room into intelligence reports, and from there it began to seep into the consciousness of a select few journalists in Mexico City who specialized in decoding the whispers that emanated from the country's corridors of power. One such journalist, a man whose career was built on a patient, almost geological study of corruption, began to follow the vapor trail of this new ghost. He did not seek out cartel gunmen or terrified peasants. He went to the Public Records Office. He started cross-referencing land deeds, corporate registries, and construction permits, searching for anomalies, for expenditures so vast they could not be explained by legitimate enterprise. His search led him eventually to the arid outskirts of Hermosillo. He found the records for a sprawling compound, an architectural absurdity registered to a series of shell corporations with no discernible business activity. The scale of the project, documented in permit after permit for concrete, steel, and imported marble, was so disproportionate to its official ownership that it functioned as a confession written in municipal code. As the journalist was tracing the palace's paper trail, American intelligence agencies were mapping its owner's aerial one. The sheer tonnage of cocaine arriving in the United States could no longer be attributed to a coalition of disparate smugglers. The data pointed to a single vertically integrated logistics network of terrifying efficiency. They began to build a profile of its CEO, a faceless entity whose corporate genius was reshaping the entire global drug trade. The palace in Hermosillo, once a symbol of untouchable power, began to transform into a liability. Its Arabian fantasy, so alien to the landscape, was a beacon for anyone looking for the impossible. The very audacity that was meant to project strength now drew the kind of attention its owner had spent a lifetime avoiding. The fortress designed to guarantee invisibility was paradoxically making its master a subject of intense curiosity. Within the compound, the atmosphere grew heavy with a new kind of silence. The disciplined quiet of a corporate headquarters was replaced by the tense stillness of a court consumed by suspicion. Staff who had served for years were suddenly dismissed without explanation. Conversations were held in clipped tones, away from the ornate walls that were now suspected of having ears. The master's paranoia was becoming contagious, infecting the very air of his sanctuary. A physical flaw appeared, mirroring the systemic stress. In the grand ballroom, a hairline crack spiderwebbed out from beneath a massive marble column. It was almost invisible, a detail one would only notice if they were looking for imperfections. But it was there, a silent testament to a foundational pressure the structure was no longer able to perfectly conceal. The flawless facade had been compromised. Friction also began to spark from within the dynasty itself. A younger brother of Carrillo, lacking the leader's monastic discipline, became embroiled in a violent public dispute in a Juarez nightclub. It was a clumsy, brutish affair over a woman, ending in a shooting that could not be entirely suppressed. It was a flagrant violation of the family's primary directive: operate without being seen. Amado's retribution was said to have been surgical and terrifying, a lesson in discretion delivered in a soundproofed room. But the incident had already breached the perimeter. For the first time in years, the name Carrillo Fuentes was officially linked to an act of public violence, a data point that could not be scrubbed from every police blotter and whispered about by every local official. The journalist in Mexico City made the connection. The family name from the Juarez police report echoed the rumored patronage behind the architectural phantom in Hermosillo. It was a fragile link, based more on instinct than evidence, but it was the first thread pulled from the tightly woven cloak of Carrillo's anonymity. The pressure from the United States government became a diplomatic sledgehammer. Armed with new intelligence about the scale of the Lord of the Skies operation, Washington began to exert immense force on the Mexican presidency. They demanded the dismantling of the Juarez cartel, and for the first time, they attached a name to their demands, Amado Carrillo Fuentes. The ghost was no longer a whisper. He was now the primary target of a binational manhunt. This external siege amplified the internal decay. The trust that held Carrillo's federation of lieutenants together began to corrode under the acid of his deepening paranoia. He began to question the loyalty of his oldest partners, seeing potential betrayal in every delayed report and every coded phone call. The decentralized structure that had been his strength was now becoming a network of potential enemies. Work on the palace ground to a halt. The constant hum of construction ceased, and the unfinished wings were abandoned to the elements. The exposed rebar, once reaching for the sky as a promise of future grandeur, now stood stark and rusting against the blue desert sky. They were no longer symbols of infinite ambition, but the first ruins of a falling empire. A dark, spreading stain appeared on a hand-plastered ceiling in one of the guest suites. It was the result of a slow, persistent leak from the plumbing of the jacuzzi directly above. The very luxury that defined the palace was now insidiously rotting it from the inside out, a perfect metaphor for an empire whose own weight and excess were becoming the instruments of its destruction. The Lord of the Skies retreated ever deeper into his creation. He was seen less and less in the grand halls and courtyards, preferring the interior, windowless sections of the compound. The palace ceased to be his throne and became his bunker. The man who commanded a continent from the air was now a prisoner of the earth, trapped within the magnificent walls of his own fear. His lifelong obsession with anonymity now curdled into a consuming terror. The few grainy photographs that existed of him taken years ago became the most potent threat to his existence. He understood that his face was the one vulnerability his fortress could not protect him from. To be seen, to be identified, would be a death sentence. The great fountain in the central courtyard began to falter more frequently. Its pumps struggled, its flow becoming weak and intermittent. The water that filled its basins was no longer clear and vibrant, but cloudy, tinged with the fine dust that blew in from the surrounding desert. The sound was no longer the confident roar of absolute power, but the ragged, weakening pulse of a kingdom bleeding out from 1,000 invisible cuts. The end did not arrive with the thunder of a battering ram, but with the sterile silence of a coroner's report. News of Amado Carrillo Fuentes' death on a Mexico City operating table traveled not as a shockwave, but as a creeping paralysis through the nervous system of his empire. The ghost had finally, clumsily, given up his own ghost. In Hermosillo, the palace stood unchanged, its walls still impenetrable, but the immense invisible pressure that had held it together vanished in an instant. The throne was empty. The power vacuum was immediate and absolute. Without the central processing unit to direct the flow of information and capital, the entire network seized. For days, the palace remained in a state of suspended animation, a ship whose captain had been vaporized from the bridge. The staff, cut off from their chain of command, moved through the opulent halls like automatons, their disciplined routines now devoid of purpose. The fortress was waiting silently for the world it had held at bay to inevitably come crashing in. The arrival was not an assault, but an occupation. A convoy of dark government vehicles moved through the upscale neighborhood at dawn, their arrival a quiet, bureaucratic assertion of dominance. Helicopters circled high overhead, their presence not a threat of attack, but one of cold clinical observation. They did not lay siege to the fortress. They simply surrounded it, their sheer numbers a statement that the private reality within these walls was officially over. The great iron gates, designed to withstand a direct assault, were opened not by explosives, but by the rustle of a search warrant. The moment federal agents stepped across the threshold was the true point of collapse. The hermetic seal was broken. The outside world, with its laws, its consequences, and its grime, poured into the pristine, artificial universe Carrillo had built. The air inside, once thick with power, thinned into the common atmosphere of a crime scene. The initial teams moved through the cavernous spaces with a tense professional awe. Their tactical gear and black uniforms were a stark, brutalist intrusion against the delicate Moorish arches and intricate tile work. They were aliens in this fantasy land, their purpose not to admire the dream but to dismantle it piece by piece. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on floors, once reserved for silk slippers, and the echo of their clipped commands in the vast, empty halls. The search was a systematic violation, an autopsy of a building. Teams spread out, following architectural blueprints that now served as tactical maps. They moved through the labyrinth, not as confused intruders, but as methodical dissectors, their goal to turn the house inside out, to expose every secret held within its bones. The very design meant to disorient and protect was now being clinically deconstructed by the logic of the state. The grand ballroom, the stage for so many calculated displays of power, was converted into a field command post. Evidence bags and communication equipment were laid out across the imported marble floors, where cartel lieutenants and corrupt generals had once drank cognac. The room's purpose was inverted. From a space of untouchable conspiracy, it became a processing center for the evidence of its own ruin. The legends of the house were methodically tested and proven true. A hollow sound behind a wall of hand-carved cedar paneling in the library led to the discovery of a hidden door. It opened not with a cinematic groan, but with the quiet click of a magnetic lock being forced, revealing a narrow, concrete-lined passage that snaked into the earth beneath the palace. The secret architecture was being laid bare. Within these hidden spaces, they found the fortress's true heart. Not treasure, but hardware. Racks of encrypted communications equipment, caches of military-grade weaponry still in their plastic wrapping, and stacks of ledgers detailing payments to officials whose names would shake the foundations of the government. This was the cold, functional engine room that powered the opulent vessel above. The material symbols of wealth were the first casualties of the search. Ornate paintings were pried from the walls, not for their value, but to reveal the steel-plated safes hidden behind them. The art was tossed aside, its aesthetic purpose erased, reduced to a mere obstacle in the hunt for tangible proof of a criminal enterprise. Every object of beauty was now just a potential container for a secret. The curated silence was shattered by the sound of deconstruction. The high-pitched whine of industrial drills echoed through the courtyards as agents bored into reinforced concrete walls. The percussive clang of sledgehammers against steel safe doors replaced the festive sound of mariachi bands. The palace was being undone by the very tools of its own construction. The most intimate spaces suffered the most profound violation. In Carrillo's private suite, closets were emptied, their contents of expensive conservative suits and simple leather shoes piled on the bed. Each pocket was searched, each possession catalogued. It was an attempt to reconstruct the man from the mundane objects he left behind, a final posthumous stripping of his anonymity. The very foundations were attacked. In rooms where the floors rang hollow, teams used pry bars and jackhammers to rip up the marble tiles and polished hardwood. They exposed a subfloor of reinforced concrete, searching for the rumored vaults beneath. The perfect, polished surfaces of the palace were shattered, revealing the raw, grey structure underneath. The private chapel became just another room to be processed. Agents moved past the hand-carved pews and stained glass windows with professional indifference. The altar where oaths of loyalty had been sanctified was dusted for fingerprints. The sacred was being treated as profane, the ultimate desecration of the moral universe the cartel had built for itself. The water was gone. The Olympic-sized pools had been drained, their brilliant turquoise tiles now forming a vast, empty basin, a ceramic wound in the earth. The jacuzzis in every suite were dry, their jets silent. In the central courtyard, the great fountain was a husk, its intricate stone tiers coated in a film of dust, its pipes having surrendered their last drops of stagnant water. The state of incompletion was now the state of permanence. The unfinished wings, with their skeletal rebar reaching for the sky, were no longer a sign of limitless ambition. They were now a fitting monument to a project cut short, a graphic illustration of an empire that collapsed before its final stone could be laid. The ruin was not a consequence of the fall, it was the empire's final frozen form. When the agents finally withdrew, they left behind a hollowed-out carcass. The opulence was scarred, the secrets exposed, the magic violently dispelled. The palace was no longer a home, a fortress, or a kingdom. It was a piece of evidence, a massive, inert asset seized by the state, its value now calculated not in power, but in square meters on a government ledger. A new silence descended upon the property, heavier and more profound than before. It was not the weighted silence of power held in reserve, but the absolute vacant silence of a tomb. The ghost of Amado Carrillo Fuentes had been exorcised, but in its place lingered a more palpable haunting, the ghost of the ruin itself, a monument not to a man but to the crushing material weight of his absence. So where does power truly reside? In concrete, or in what survives its fall? Subscribe to witness the final decay of the palace and unravel the enduring legacy of the man who vanished from within its walls. Decades have passed, and the desert has begun its slow, patient work of reclamation. The Palace of 1001 Nights is no longer a crime scene, nor is it a monument. It is a carcass, picked clean by time and opportunism. The wind, its only constant resident, moves freely through the hollowed-out halls, carrying fine grains of sand that scour the last vestiges of paint from the walls and polish the edges of broken glass. The silence is different now. It is not the weighted silence of secrets, but the thin, hollow silence of complete and utter absence. The perimeter walls, once a declaration of absolute exclusion, now serve as a public canvas. Layers of graffiti cover the stone, the vibrant, chaotic art of a generation that knows the palace only as a ghost story. The iron gates hang askew on their hinges, a permanent rusted invitation into the ruin. The fortress that was designed to seal a private universe off from the world has become porous, its defenses breached not by force but by the simple, relentless pressure of neglect. Inside, the texture of decay is absolute. The scent of sun-baked dust and dry rot has permanently replaced the memory of cedar and marble. Pigeons roost in the barrel-vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom, their droppings a stark white counterpoint to the grime on the floor. Where opulent rugs once lay, there is now a mosaic of shattered tiles, weeds pushing up through the cracks, and the detritus of squatters and urban explorers, the final ignominious inhabitants of a king's private world. At the heart of the compound, the great fountain is a tombstone. Its dry concrete basin is a gaping wound in the earth, filled with rubble, rusted metal, and the skeletal remains of desert shrubs. The intricate stonework is fractured, its graceful lines obscured by dirt and spray paint. The symbol of an endless torrent of power has become the perfect monument to drought, a dry husk that testifies not to the presence of water, but to its profound and irreversible loss. The structure exists in a state of legal and physical purgatory. Seized by a government that has never known what to do with it, the palace is a white elephant of immense proportions, too expensive to maintain, too infamous to sell, and too solidly built to be easily demolished. It simply remains. It is a scar on the landscape of Hermosillo, a physical problem with no solution, its continued existence a quiet testament to the paralysis that often follows such a spectacular collapse. The ghost for whom this palace was built has himself dissolved into myth. Amado Carrillo Fuentes is officially dead, a casualty of his own obsession with invisibility. Yet the sterile finality of a medical report has never been enough to contain his legend. Whispers persist that he faked his death, that the man on the operating table was a double, and that the Lord of the Skies simply flew away one last time. The discovery of his surgeon's bodies encased in concrete only thickened the fog, transforming his end from a fact into a dark, unanswerable question. His material empire met a more definitive fate. Without its master, the Juarez cartel fractured, splintering into warring factions that unleashed a tidal wave of violence upon the border. The sophisticated corporate structure he had built devolved into crude, chaotic bloodshed. The legacy of his logistical genius was not a lasting peace, but a perpetual war, the echoes of which still ring out in the streets of Ciudad Juarez. The fall of the palace did not end the violence, it merely decentralized it. Today, the palace serves as a stage for a different kind of folklore. It is a destination for the curious and the reckless, a place where teenagers dare each other to spend the night, and where the story of the invisible king is told in hushed, embellished tones. It is no longer a symbol of power, but a source of local legend, its terrifying history softened by time into a thrilling, cautionary tale whispered in the dark. The ultimate irony is etched into its every crumbling surface. The man who lived in terror of being seen built a monument that cannot be ignored. The fortress designed to grant him absolute privacy and security became the most public and enduring evidence of his existence. It was a cage built of paranoia and gilded with vanity, a physical manifestation of a mind at war with itself, and in the end, the structure outlasted the system it was meant to protect. Perhaps what we build says less about the power we command than about the fears we are trying to contain. This structure, conceived as a testament to a man's dominion over the world, now stands as a monument to his terror of being erased by it. Its ruins are not the story of a criminal's ambition, but of a ghost's desperate, failed attempt to build himself a body of stone and steel. The sheer audacity of its construction once spoke to a power that felt limitless, untouchable. Now the sheer totality of its decay speaks to a more fundamental truth. It is an architectural phantom, a monument to an ambition so vast it consumed itself, leaving behind not a kingdom but a warning. The palace no longer defends its secrets, it has become one. If stories like this make you see power from a different angle, subscribe to follow other downfalls as astonishing as this one.